My name is Claire Bennett. Today's story is about my life. Whether you've experienced family betrayal yourself or not, I think my story will make you question what forgiveness really means. 9 years ago, I fell in love with a kind, hard-working man named Ethan Brooks, who happened to be biracial. To me, love was simple. I had found the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, but my family saw things very differently. Have you ever had to choose between the people who raised you and the person you loved most? It's a decision no one imagines making until life suddenly places it right in front of them. For me, that moment came when I was 33 years old, and the consequences of my choice followed me for nearly a decade. I had always believed my family wasn't perfect, but I never questioned their love. Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I was taught that family came first, that blood was thicker than water, and that no matter how difficult life became, the Bennetts would always stand together. Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and birthday celebrations were traditions I believed would continue for the rest of my life. That belief stayed with me until I met Ethan Brooks. We met during our final year of college while working together on a software development project. Ethan wasn't loud or flashy. He was thoughtful, patient, and incredibly intelligent. He listened more than he spoke, remembered the smallest details about me, and always found ways to make even my hardest days feel lighter. Our friendship slowly turned into love, and before long, I couldn't imagine a future without him. There was only one problem. Ethan was biracial. At first, I convinced myself it wouldn't matter. This was a different generation. Surely my family would care more about the kind of man Ethan was than the color of his skin. He had a successful career ahead of him, treated me with respect, and shared the same dream of building a stable, happy life together. In my mind, those were the things that truly mattered. For weeks, I carefully planned how I would introduce Ethan to my parents. I rehearsed conversations in my head and imagined the smiles that would appear when they saw how happy I was. I pictured my mother asking Ethan about his job, my father joking with him over dinner, and my younger sister eventually welcoming him into the family. I truly believed that once they met him, every fear I had would disappear. Instead, that evening became one I would never forget. The atmosphere changed almost the moment Ethan walked through the front door. The smiles felt forced. The conversation never found its rhythm. My mother, Margaret, looked at Ethan with a coldness I had never seen before, while my father, Robert, avoided looking directly at him. My younger sister, Olivia, barely spoke throughout dinner, answering questions with short replies before staring down at her plate. When dinner finally ended, Ethan politely thanked everyone for having him and quietly drove home. I stayed behind, hoping to clear the tension I had felt all evening. I expected uncomfortable questions, maybe concerns about our future, but I still believed everything could be worked out with an honest conversation. What happened instead shattered every expectation I had ever carried about the people I called family. The morning after that uncomfortable dinner, I woke up hoping the previous night had simply been a misunderstanding. I convinced myself that maybe my parents had only been surprised and needed a little time to adjust. After all, every family faces difficult conversations from time to time. I believed that once emotions settled, they would see Ethan the way I did, not through prejudice, but through his character, kindness, and unwavering respect for me. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could to bridge the growing distance. I called my mother several times, but every conversation ended quickly and awkwardly. She spoke politely, yet there was an unmistakable coldness in her voice. Whenever I mentioned Ethan's name, the conversation seemed to fall silent, even through the phone. My father offered little more than short answers, avoiding any real discussion. My younger sister refused to return my messages altogether. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "You don't have to fight this battle alone," he told me one evening as we sat together in our small apartment. I leaned against him, trying to hide the tears forming in my eyes. "I just don't understand," I whispered. "They've always taught me to judge people by who they are. Ethan, you're everything I ever hoped to find in someone." He gently squeezed my hand. "If they can't see that, it's not because of anything you've done." His calmness became my greatest source of strength. While my own family seemed to be slipping further away, Ethan never once pressured me to choose between them. In fact, he encouraged me to keep trying. Weeks later, I decided to share another piece of news. Ethan and I were engaged. I imagined that maybe this announcement would soften my parents' hearts. Perhaps the reality of losing their daughter would make them reconsider. Instead, it became the moment everything truly fell apart. A few days after announcing our engagement, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting on the front belonged to my mother. For a brief moment, hope returned. Maybe this was the blessing I had been waiting for. With trembling hands, I opened the letter. Inside, there were only a few sentences. My mother wrote that if I chose to marry Ethan, I would be choosing a life without my family. She said Ethan was not one of us, and claimed that I was throwing away generations of family values for someone I barely knew. The letter ended with a painful message. If I went through with the wedding, I should not expect my parents to attend, or to be part of my life afterward. I read the letter again and again, unable to believe the words in front of me. Every sentence felt colder than the last. It wasn't written in anger. It was written with complete certainty, as though the decision had already been made long before Ethan had ever stepped into our home. That evening, I drove to my parents' house, determined to speak to them face to face. I stood on the front porch, clutching the letter tightly in my hands, hoping that once we looked into each other's eyes, everything could still be saved. I stood on my parents' front porch for several minutes before finally finding the courage to knock. I could hear movement inside the house, followed by the familiar sound of footsteps approaching the door. For a brief second, hope returned. Maybe the letter had been written in the heat of the moment. Maybe seeing me standing there would remind my parents that I was still their daughter. The front door slowly opened. My mother looked at me without surprise, almost as if she had been expecting this visit. There was no smile, no warmth, and certainly no invitation to come inside. My father appeared in the hallway behind her, keeping a quiet distance, while my younger sister stood near the staircase with her arms folded across her chest. I held up the letter with trembling hands. "Mom, please tell me you didn't mean this." My mother's expression never changed. I meant every word. I felt my stomach tighten. "I love him," I said quietly. "He's a good man. Isn't that what matters?" She shook her head. "You've made your choice. I haven't chosen against you." "But you have." No matter how desperately I tried to explain, every sentence was met with silence or rejection. My father avoided speaking altogether, refusing to meet my eyes. I silently begged him to say something, anything, but he remained motionless. My younger sister finally broke the silence, not to comfort me, but to make it painfully clear where she stood. "You knew this would happen," she said. "Don't act surprised." Those words hurt almost as much as the letter itself. In that moment, I realized I wasn't fighting a misunderstanding anymore. I was fighting a decision that had already been made. When my mother slowly closed the front door, I remained standing on the porch, staring at the house where I had grown up. Every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every childhood memory suddenly felt as though it belonged to someone else. I had walked to that house believing I could save my family. Instead, I walked away realizing I had lost them. A month later, Ethan and I were married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends, supportive coworkers, and Ethan's relatives. Our wedding wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with genuine love and laughter. Even so, one side of the ceremony remained painfully empty. The seats reserved for my parents and my sister stayed untouched from beginning to end. I kept glancing toward the entrance, hoping that at the last minute they might change their minds. They never came. After the wedding, I still refused to give up. On my mother's birthday, I mailed her a thoughtful card along with a handwritten letter. A week later, the envelope came back. Stamped across the front were 2 words I would never forget. Return to sender. I told myself it was probably a mistake. Months later, I mailed a Christmas card. It came back unopened. The following year, I sent birthday wishes to both of my parents. Both envelopes were returned. Every holiday became another reminder that the silence wasn't accidental. It was intentional. I left voicemails asking how everyone was doing. None were returned. After the birth of my first child, I sent family photos, believing that becoming grandparents might soften their hearts. The package arrived back on my doorstep unopened. As the years passed, I slowly stopped expecting replies, but I never stopped noticing the pattern. Every rejection carried the same painful message, without anyone ever having to say the words aloud. After the last package came back unopened, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to bed. The small box containing photographs of our newborn daughter rested in front of me, exactly as I had mailed it only days before. The edges were slightly worn from shipping, but the seal had never been broken. My parents hadn't even looked inside. They had rejected not only me but also the innocent child they had never met. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not because I expected anything different, but because every returned envelope felt like losing my family all over again. I had spent years hoping that time would soften their hearts. Instead, every birthday, every holiday, and every major milestone only proved that the distance between us had become permanent. The following morning, I wiped away my tears, made myself a cup of coffee, and did something that would quietly shape the next chapter of my life. I walked into a nearby office supply store. I wasn't looking for anything expensive. I wandered through the aisles until a simple navy blue 3-ring binder caught my attention. It wasn't special, no fancy design, no decorative cover, just a sturdy binder with enough room to hold hundreds of pages. Without thinking too much about it, I bought it along with plastic sheet protectors, divider tabs, and a small label maker. When I arrived home, Ethan noticed the shopping bag sitting on the dining room table. Starting a new project, he asked with a smile. I looked at the empty binder before answering. In a way, that evening, I gathered every returned birthday card I had saved in a drawer. Then came the unopened Christmas cards, the returned baby photos, copies of emails that had never received replies, screenshots of unanswered messages, and records of every voicemail I had left over the years. One by one, I slid each item into a plastic sleeve. I wrote the exact date on a label. Then I added a short description beneath it. No opinions, no angry comments, no emotional speeches, only facts. Returned unopened. Voicemail left. No response. Family photos returned by mail. I didn't create that binder out of hatred. It wasn't a plan for revenge. It wasn't something I expected anyone else to ever see. It became something much simpler. Proof. I understood how memories could change over time. People often forgot uncomfortable moments or rewrote painful history to make themselves feel better. I didn't want that to happen. I wanted an honest record of what had actually happened, even if no one else ever cared to read it. Months turned into years, and the binder slowly grew thicker. Every new rejection earned another page. Every ignored attempt at reconciliation found its place inside. Eventually, 29 documents filled its sleeves, each carefully arranged in chronological order. Looking through the binder felt like reading the story of a relationship falling apart one page at a time. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming arguments or public confrontations. Instead, there was something far more painful, a steady pattern of silence, indifference, and deliberate absence that spoke louder than any insult ever could. Ethan never asked me to throw the binder away. He understood that it wasn't preventing me from moving forward. In a strange way, it was allowing me to do exactly that. By placing each disappointment onto paper, instead of carrying it endlessly in my heart, I slowly found the strength to stop chasing people who had already decided to let me go. As I slowly go of the hope that my family would return, I poured every ounce of my energy into building the life I still had. Instead of spending my nights wondering why my parents refused to answer my calls, I began spending them beside Ethan, working at our small dining room table covered with laptops, notebooks, and empty coffee mugs. The pain of rejection didn't disappear, but it became fuel for something far more meaningful. Ethan had always dreamed of creating software that could help large companies manage compliance, security, and internal operations more efficiently. It wasn't the kind of idea that attracted instant attention or made flashy headlines. Most people found it boring. Investors often wanted exciting consumer apps, not business software. But Ethan believed there was a real need in the market, and I believed in Ethan. During the day, we worked full-time jobs to pay our bills. At night, we became business partners. I handled project management, customer communication, and financial planning while Ethan focused on writing code, fixing bugs, and developing new features. Some nights we worked until 2 or 3 in the morning, only to wake up a few hours later and repeat the same exhausting routine. Money was always tight. There were months when every dollar had to be carefully planned. Vacations disappeared from our calendar. Expensive dinners became home-cooked meals. New furniture could wait another year. We drove older cars, postponed unnecessary purchases, and celebrated small victories instead of chasing luxury. Still, neither of us complained. Whenever one of us felt discouraged, the other found a reason to keep going. When an investor rejected our proposal, Ethan reminded me that every successful company had faced rejection. When a potential client chose a competitor, I reminded them that one, no, didn't define our future. Slowly, our hard work began to pay off. Our first major client signed a contract worth more than we had ever imagined possible. It wasn't enough to make us wealthy, but it proved that someone believed in what we were building. Then another client joined, and another. Satisfied customers started recommending our software to other businesses. Positive reviews spread throughout the industry, and referrals became more common than cold calls. For the first time, Ethan and I hired employees. Instead of trying to do everything ourselves, watching people walk into our small office on the first day felt surreal. We weren't just building software anymore. We were building a company. Even as our business grew, I never forgot where we had started. The navy blue binder remained tucked safely inside a cabinet in my home office. Occasionally, I noticed it while searching for other files, but I rarely opened it anymore. The pain it contained had become part of my past, not something I lived with every day. Years passed, and our company, Compliance Corp., continued expanding. We opened new offices. Major corporations signed long-term contracts with us. Industry magazines began mentioning our company among the fastest growing businesses in its field. People who had never heard of Ethan before suddenly wanted meetings with him. Investors who once ignored our emails were now competing for opportunities to work with us. Sometimes I smiled at how quickly the world could change. Our success hadn't come because we were lucky. It came because we kept showing up on the days when quitting would have been much easier. By the 8th year of building Compliance Corp's, Ethan and I barely recognized the company we had once run from the corner of our apartment. What had started with 2 laptops, a folding table, and endless late nights had grown into a respected software company serving businesses across the country. Our team had expanded from just the 2 of us to dozens of talented employees who believed in the same vision. Every milestone reminded me that persistence often accomplished what talent alone could not. Our company's reputation continued to spread throughout the business world. Large corporations that had once overlooked us were now requesting demonstrations of our software. Industry conferences invited Ethan to speak about innovation and leadership. I found myself meeting with executives, investors, and board members instead of worrying about unpaid bills or overdue invoices. Life was changing in ways we had never imagined. One Friday afternoon, I walked into Ethan's office carrying 2 cups of coffee. He was staring quietly at his computer screen with an expression I couldn't immediately read. "Everything okay?" I asked. Ethan slowly looked up before breaking into a smile. "I think this is the biggest opportunity we've ever had." He turned the monitor toward me. A major investment firm had officially expressed interest in helping Compliance Corp prepare for the next stage of growth. It wasn't just another funding offer. They believed our company had the potential to become one of the industry's leading technology businesses. Over the following months, life became even more demanding. Meetings filled every calendar. Lawyers reviewed documents. Financial advisors examined every detail of our company. Auditors spent weeks verifying records, while executives discussed strategies for taking the business public. There were days when I barely had time to eat lunch. Some nights, Ethan and I stayed at the office long after everyone else had gone home, reviewing contracts page by page. We understood that one mistake during this process could affect everything we had worked for over nearly a decade. Despite the pressure, we never forgot why we had started. Neither of us chased luxury. Neither of us built the company to impress people. We simply wanted to create something meaningful that would outlast both of us. Finally, the day arrived. Compliance Corp officially began trading on the NASDAQ. Inside our company's headquarters, employees gathered around large television screens as the opening bell rang. Cheers echoed throughout the building. Some team members hugged each other. Others wiped away tears as they remembered how difficult the early years had been. I reached for Ethan's hand without saying a word. Neither of us cared much about headlines or media attention. What mattered was the journey that had brought us there. Within hours, financial news outlets reported our company's successful public debut. Analysts praised its growth, and business publications highlighted the remarkable story behind its founders. As investors responded positively, our company's market value climbed higher than anyone had expected. By the end of the week, financial advisors estimated that Ethan and my combined net worth had reached approximately $44 million. The number felt almost unreal. Just a few years earlier, we had celebrated being able to afford new office chairs without worrying about our bank account. Now, reporters wanted interviews. Business magazines requested photo shoots. Industry leaders who had never returned Ethan's emails suddenly remembered his name. I welcomed our success with quiet gratitude, never realizing that somewhere far away, the people who had ignored my existence for 9 years were beginning to pay very close attention to every headline mentioning our family's new fortune. I had never imagined that success could travel faster than forgiveness. For nearly 9 years, my phone had remained almost silent whenever it came to my family. No birthday calls, no holiday greetings, no messages asking how Ethan, the children, or I were doing. It was as though I had disappeared from their lives the moment I married Ethan. Eventually, I accepted that silence and learned to live without expecting anything different. But success has a way of reaching places that love never could. Only a few weeks after Compliance Corp made national business news, I noticed something unusual. My professional social media profile, which had remained relatively quiet for years, suddenly began receiving visits from unfamiliar names. Some people viewed my profile several times within a single week. Others searched for Ethan online, looking through his interviews and company announcements. At first, I assumed it was simply the attention that came with becoming the co-founder of a publicly traded company. Then I recognized one of the names, my younger sister. She had viewed my profile. I stared at the notification for several seconds. It wasn't because she had tried to contact me. There was no message, no apology, no explanation, just a quiet visit that raised more questions than answers. A few days later, another notification appeared. This time, it was an old family friend who hadn't spoken to me in years. Then another. It became impossible to ignore the pattern. People connected to my parents were suddenly showing an unusual interest in my life. One evening, while Ethan and I were cleaning up after dinner, I mentioned it to him. "I think my family's been looking me up." Ethan paused before setting a plate into the dishwasher. "Have they reached out?" I shook my head. Not directly. He didn't seem surprised. People get curious when they read headlines. I wanted to believe that was all it was, but deep down, something felt different. Meanwhile, several towns away, conversations were taking place inside my parents' home that hadn't happened in nearly a decade. My mother sat at the kitchen table reading another article about Compliance Corp. The newspaper described Ethan as one of the country's rising technology entrepreneurs and estimated the company's remarkable valuation. My name appeared beside his in nearly every story. My younger sister looked over my mother's shoulder. "So, they're really worth that much." My mother folded the newspaper carefully. Apparently. Neither of them mentioned the wedding they had refused to attend. Neither of them mentioned the birthday cards they had returned unopened. Instead, their conversation focused entirely on numbers. How much our company was worth. How much stock I might own. How wealthy Ethan and I must be now. Curiosity slowly turned into calculation. Over the following weeks, my younger sister continued searching for information online. She watched Ethan's interviews on business networks. She read articles about our company's growth. She even searched public records discussing executive compensation and stock ownership, trying to estimate just how much my share of the business might be worth. Every new article seemed to confirm the same thing. I wasn't just comfortable. I was exceptionally successful. My mother began talking about retirement more often. Medical expenses suddenly became part of family conversations. Old financial problems that had existed for years were now discussed with unusual urgency. For the first time since I had walked away from my childhood home, my name was being spoken regularly around my family's dinner table. Not because anyone missed me. Not because anyone regretted what had happened, but because the daughter they had chosen to forget had become someone they believed could solve every problem they had ever ignored. As the weeks passed, I tried to ignore the strange feeling that someone from my past was quietly watching my life from a distance. I had no proof that my family was planning anything, but the sudden wave of online activity was impossible to dismiss. Profiles connected to old neighbors, distant relatives, and family friends kept appearing in places they had never appeared before. It was as if an invisible chain of conversations had begun, with each person gathering another small piece of information about the life I had built without them. I refused to let it distract me. Compliance Corp was entering another exciting stage of growth. New partnerships were being finalized. Our employees were celebrating record breaking results, and my calendar was packed with meetings from early morning until late evening. I had spent too many years fighting emotional battles to allow old memories to steal my peace now. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, something unexpected happened. I received a text message from an unfamiliar number. It contained only one sentence. "Hi Claire, it's Olivia. I hope you're doing well." I stared at the screen for several moments. 9 years. 9 years without a birthday card. 9 years without a phone call. 9 years without anyone asking whether I was alive, healthy, or happy. And now, suddenly, a cheerful greeting. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I placed my phone face down on my desk and continued working. An hour later, another message arrived. "I know it's been a long time. I'd really like to catch up." Still, there was no mention of the past. No acknowledgement of the silence. No apology. No explanation. Just an invitation to pretend that nearly a decade had never happened. That evening, I showed the messages to Ethan. He read them quietly before handing my phone back. "What do you think?" he asked. I sighed. "I don't know what to think." "Do you believe she misses you?" I hesitated before answering. "I want to believe that." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I looked away. "I honestly don't know." A few days later, Olivia called. I let it ring. Then it rang again the following day. On the third attempt, curiosity finally won. I answered. The conversation began with awkward small talk. Olivia asked about the weather. She complimented me on my recent business interviews. She laughed about our old childhood memories, as though the missing years between us had simply disappeared. I listened patiently. I kept waiting for the words I had imagined hearing countless times. "I'm sorry." They never came. Instead, Olivia gradually shifted the conversation. She asked how large our company had become. She wondered whether going public had changed my daily life. She casually mentioned seeing news reports about our company's success and joked that I was probably too rich to remember ordinary people anymore. I smiled politely but said very little. Every question seemed to circle back to the same subject: money, success, business, not family, not healing, not regret. Before ending the call, Olivia suggested that we should meet for coffee sometime. "It would be nice to reconnect," she said warmly. I agreed that maybe one day we could. After hanging up, I sat quietly in my office, replaying every minute of the conversation in my mind. Something about it felt incomplete. Olivia had spent nearly half an hour talking to me, yet somehow managed to avoid discussing the one thing that truly mattered. Not once had she acknowledged my wedding. Not once had she mentioned the birthday cards that had been returned unopened. Not once had she apologized for disappearing from my life. The conversation had sounded friendly on the surface, but beneath every pleasant word, I sensed another purpose slowly revealing itself. One that had nothing to do with rebuilding a broken relationship and everything to do with discovering just how much her successful older sister might be willing to give. After my conversation with Olivia, life returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. I buried myself in work, attended meetings, and spent my evenings with Ethan and our children. I refused to let one unexpected phone call reopen wounds that had taken years to heal. If Olivia truly wanted to rebuild our relationship, I believed the next step had to come with honesty, not casual conversation. Until then, I chose to keep my expectations low. Nearly 3 weeks passed without another call or message. Then, on a quiet Saturday morning, I was helping my daughter decorate cookies in the kitchen while Ethan worked in the backyard. The house was peaceful, filled with laughter and the comforting sounds of an ordinary weekend. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about my family at all. Then the doorbell rang. I glanced toward the front window, expecting to see a delivery driver or perhaps one of our neighbors. Instead, I froze. Standing on my front porch was my mother. Beside her, sat a small carry-on suitcase. My heart began pounding. For several seconds, I simply stood there, unable to move. I hadn't seen my mother in 9 years. Time had changed both of us. Her hair had turned noticeably grayer, and there were new lines across her face, but I recognized her instantly. She was the same woman who had written me that letter. The same woman who had closed the front door all those years ago. Ethan noticed the silence and walked into the hallway. "Everything okay?" he asked. I swallowed hard before answering. "It's my mother." He looked through the glass beside the door and quietly nodded. "What do you want to do?" I didn't answer right away. I stared at the woman standing outside, wondering what could possibly bring her here after nearly a decade of complete silence. Was someone sick? Had something terrible happened? Or had my mother finally come to say the words I had waited years to hear? Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. She offered a hesitant smile. "Hello, Claire." The greeting sounded strangely ordinary, as though we had spoken only a few weeks ago instead of nearly 10 years. "Hi, Mom," I replied softly. There was an uncomfortable silence before she glanced toward the suitcase. "I was in the area," she said. "I thought maybe we could talk." I knew that wasn't true. My parents lived several hours away. People don't simply end up in this neighborhood by accident. Still, I stepped aside. "Come in." She walked into my house slowly, looking around as though she were visiting a stranger's home. Family photographs covered the walls. Children's artwork decorated the refrigerator. The house felt warm, welcoming, and filled with the life I had built without my parents. She paused in front of a framed family portrait. "You've made a beautiful home." "Thank you," I answered. Ethan greeted my mother politely before giving us space to talk. He gathered our children and suggested they spend some time in the backyard, quietly understanding that whatever happened next needed privacy. I led my mother into the kitchen. I made coffee exactly the way she had always liked it years ago, surprised that I still remembered such a small detail. As we sat across from one another at the table, I searched her face for some sign of regret. I wanted to believe that this visit wasn't about money. I wanted to believe that 9 years had finally changed something inside the woman who had once chosen pride over her own daughter. For several quiet minutes, neither my mother nor I said much. The coffee sat untouched between us, and the silence felt heavier than any argument either of us could have started. I studied her face, searching for the emotions I had imagined countless times over the years. I expected hesitation, guilt, maybe even tears. Instead, she appeared unusually calm, as though she had already rehearsed this conversation many times before arriving. I decided to speak first. "I never thought I'd see you here." She gave a small nod. Life has a way of changing people. I wanted to believe those words. I wanted to believe that the years apart had forced both of us to reflect on what had been lost. I hoped this conversation would begin with memories, apologies, or at least an acknowledgement of the pain we had both carried. Instead, my mother reached into her leather handbag. For one brief moment, my heart lifted. Maybe it was a letter. Maybe she had written down everything she found too difficult to say out loud. She carefully removed a neatly folded packet of papers and placed it on the kitchen table. She slid it across toward me. "I'd like you to look this over." I unfolded the pages slowly. The first line immediately caught my attention. "Family financial support plan." My hopeful expression faded. I continued reading. The document listed retirement expenses, mortgage payoff, medical bills, monthly living assistance, college tuition for my younger sister's son. Every request was carefully organized with estimated costs beside each item, almost like a business proposal prepared for an investor. At the bottom of the final page was a total. $850,000. I looked up from the document, waiting for the rest of the conversation. Nothing came. My mother folded her hands together. I know it seems like a lot. I remained silent. You and Ethan have done incredibly well for yourselves. Still no response. We're family, Claire. Those words echoed painfully through the room. Family, the same word that had disappeared from every birthday, every Christmas, every phone call. I calmly turned the pages once more, reading each request carefully. Not because I was considering them, but because I was searching for something. One sentence. 2 simple words. I'm sorry, they weren't there. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. You've listed every expense. She nodded. We've had a difficult few years. I gently placed the papers back onto the table. You've explained why you need money. Another nod. But you haven't explained why you disappeared. She shifted slightly in her chair. That was a long time ago. It was 9 years? We can't change the past. My voice remained remarkably calm. No, but we can acknowledge it. She looked away toward the kitchen window. I didn't come here to argue. I understood. She hadn't driven for hours to repair our broken relationship. She had come to solve financial problems. The reconciliation I had imagined existed only in my own heart. For 9 years, I had wondered what I would say if this moment ever came. I thought I might cry. I thought I might become angry. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. Without raising my voice or showing any frustration, I slowly stood from my chair. I'll be right back, I said quietly. My mother watched with cautious optimism, perhaps believing I was going to retrieve a checkbook or speak privately with Ethan. Instead, I walked down the hallway toward my home office. I opened a cabinet that had remained untouched for months. Inside, resting exactly where I had left it all those years ago, was a simple navy blue binder that contained a history no amount of money could erase. I returned to the kitchen, carrying the navy blue binder with both hands. It looked ordinary, almost insignificant, the kind of office binder anyone might use to organize paperwork. There were no labels on the cover, no dramatic title, nothing that suggested it contained nearly a decade of heartbreak. I placed it gently on the table beside my mother's financial proposal without saying a word. She glanced at it with a puzzled expression. What's that? I rested my hand on the binder for a moment before answering. My side of the story. The room fell silent. My mother shifted uneasily in her chair, but she didn't say anything. I slowly opened the front cover. Inside, every page was protected by a clear plastic sleeve. Divider tabs separated each year, and neatly typed labels marked every document. The binder wasn't filled with opinions or emotional diary entries. It contained evidence. Dates, records, facts that could not be argued away. I carefully removed the first page. This was the birthday card I mailed to you 3 months after my wedding. I placed the envelope on the table. Across the front were the words I had memorized years ago. Return to sender, I thought. Maybe you just needed time, I said quietly. So I tried again. I turned to the next page. Another birthday card. Another unopened envelope. Another postal stamp. Another rejection. My mother looked down at the table but remained silent. I continued. This is the voicemail I left on Dad's birthday. I held up a printed phone record. I wished him a happy birthday. I asked how everyone was doing. I said I missed all of you. I gently placed the paper beside the envelopes. No one called back. The next document contained copies of my emails. I pointed to the dates. Christmas. Another page. Thanksgiving. Another. My daughter's first birthday. Each email ended with hope. Each one remained unanswered. I wasn't speaking quickly. I wasn't trying to overwhelm my mother. I simply allowed every page to tell its own story. When I reached the middle of the binder, I carefully lifted a large envelope from one of the plastic sleeves. I remember this one the most. I opened it and removed several family photographs. One showed Ethan holding our newborn daughter in the hospital. Another captured our son taking his first steps. There was a picture of the four of us smiling together on Christmas morning. I gently turned the envelope over. The seal was still completely intact. You never even opened it. My mother stared at the photographs without touching them. For the first time since arriving, she seemed unable to meet my eyes. I continued turning pages. There were screenshots of unanswered text messages, holiday invitations that had received no reply, copies of handwritten letters I had mailed over the years, each one asking for nothing more than a chance to talk. There were no accusations written anywhere in the binder, no angry notes in the margins, no insults, just a simple chronological record of every attempt I had made to keep the door open, while my family quietly closed it again and again. When I reached the final section, I looked at the divider tab marked with the current year. There are 29 documents in this binder, I said softly. Every one of them represents a moment when I reached toward my family. I gently closed the cover. Then I looked at the stack of papers my mother had brought. Your proposal is 5 pages long. My hand rested on the binder. This one took 9 years to write. The kitchen remained completely silent after my final words. The ticking clock on the wall suddenly sounded louder than it ever had before. My mother sat motionless, staring at the navy blue binder as though it had become something far heavier than paper. The financial proposal she had carefully prepared was still lying beside it. But for the first time since she arrived, it no longer seemed important. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I had spent 9 years trying to explain myself. Now, the documents were doing the talking. My mother slowly reached toward the binder. Her fingers hesitated before touching the cover, almost as if she were afraid of what she might find inside. She opened it again and carefully looked through the pages I had already shown her. Every envelope, every returned card, every unanswered email, every ignored voicemail. Each page carried a date that quietly reminded her just how much time had passed. I don't remember some of these, she finally whispered. I looked at her calmly. I do. There was no anger in my voice, only certainty. She continued turning the pages. When she reached the unopened envelope containing photographs of her grandchildren, she stopped for a long time. She gently touched one of the pictures through the plastic sleeve, but never removed it. They were so little, she murmured. I nodded. They've grown up now? Without knowing their grandmother? She closed her eyes briefly. For a moment, I wondered whether this was finally the beginning of the apology I had waited nearly a decade to hear. Instead, she sighed. We all made mistakes. I immediately recognized the difference. Not, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Just enough responsibility to spread the blame without accepting any of it. I folded my hands together on the table. I made mistakes too, I admitted. I kept hoping. She looked confused. Hoping for what? That one day you'd call. The answer hung quietly between us. I continued before she could respond. I never asked you to approve of every decision I made. I only asked you not to stop being my mother. She looked away again. You don't understand how difficult that time was. I gave a small, almost sad smile. I understand exactly how difficult it was. I gently tapped the binder, 'cause I lived every page. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The past can't be changed, No, I replied, but it can be acknowledged. Again, silence filled the room. I wasn't asking for perfection. I wasn't asking my mother to erase 9 years of pain. I wasn't even asking for an explanation anymore. I was asking for something much smaller. Honesty. One sincere sentence. One moment of accountability. She looked directly at me. So, are you saying you're not willing to help us? I noticed that after everything we had discussed, after every document we had revisited together, the conversation had somehow returned to money. Not regret, not healing, not family. Money. That answer alone told me everything I needed to know. I slowly slid my mother's proposal back across the table. I've spent 9 years trying to rebuild a relationship. I rested my hand on the binder one last time. You've spent one afternoon asking me to finance one. My mother's shoulders stiffened. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us interrupted the other. Yet the distance between us felt greater than it had the day she first closed the front door, all those years ago, because this time there were no misunderstandings left to hide behind, only undeniable facts that had stripped away every excuse and revealed the truth exactly as it had always been. My mother remained seated for another minute, her eyes fixed on the binder that had quietly dismantled every excuse she might have offered. The confidence she had carried into my home was gone. The carefully prepared financial proposal no longer looked like a reasonable request. It looked painfully out of place beside 9 years of documented silence. I waited patiently. I wasn't hoping for a miracle anymore. I simply wanted to know what my mother would choose now that every uncomfortable truth had been placed on the table. She slowly gathered the 5-page proposal and slipped it back into her handbag. Her movements were slower than before, almost hesitant, but there was still no apology. She looked at me and took a deep breath. I suppose there's nothing else to say. I held her gaze. There could have been. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? I answered gently. It means this visit could have started with, I'm sorry. The words settled heavily between us. She lowered her eyes for a moment, then quietly stood from her chair. I did what I thought was right back then. I nodded. And today? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the handle of her suitcase. I watched in silence. Part of me still wanted my mother to stop, turn around, and finally acknowledge the years we had lost. I didn't need a perfect speech. I didn't expect tears or dramatic confessions. A single sincere apology would have meant more to me than any amount of money. But that moment never came. She walked toward the front door with slow, measured steps. I followed a few feet behind. When we reached the entrance, she paused with her hand resting on the doorknob. I hope you think about what I asked. I looked at her quietly. I hope you think about what happened before you asked. For the first time, she seemed unable to find a response. She opened the door and stepped outside. The afternoon air was calm, and the neighborhood was as peaceful as ever. Birds sang from nearby trees. Children laughed somewhere down the street, and life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened inside my house. She pulled her suitcase behind her and walked down the driveway without looking back. I remained standing in the doorway until her car disappeared around the corner. Only then did I slowly close the front door. A few moments later, Ethan walked into the hallway. He didn't ask whether I had given my mother the money. He already knew the answer. Instead, he gently placed a hand on my shoulder. How are you feeling? I thought about his question for several seconds. To feel angry. And I don't. I realized that the confrontation hadn't given me revenge. It had given me clarity. For years, I had wondered whether I had exaggerated the past in my own mind. During lonely nights, I questioned myself, wondering whether I should have tried harder or forgiven sooner. The binder had answered every one of those questions. Not only for my mother, for me. I hadn't imagined the silence. I hadn't invented the rejection. I had simply lived through it. Later that evening, after our children had gone to bed, I returned the navy blue binder to the cabinet in my home office. I carefully placed it back on the shelf, exactly where it had rested for years. Then I quietly closed the cabinet door, not because the story inside had finally ended, but because I no longer needed those pages to remind me of my worth or to justify the decision I had made that afternoon. 3 days passed after my mother's visit, and life slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. I returned to work, attended meetings, and spent my evenings helping my children with their homework and sharing quiet dinners with Ethan. I didn't hear another word from my mother or my younger sister, and in many ways, I expected the silence to continue. I had accepted that not every broken relationship could be repaired, no matter how much one person wished it could. On the fourth evening, just as I was cleaning the kitchen after dinner, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. My father. For a moment, I simply stared at it. He hadn't called on my birthdays. He hadn't called when his grandchildren were born. He hadn't called after my wedding. 9 years of silence separated us. I almost let the call go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." There was a long pause before I heard his voice. "It's Dad." He sounded older than I remembered. Not just in age, but in spirit. There was a heaviness in his voice that hadn't been there years ago. I replied quietly, "I wasn't sure if you'd answer." I wasn't sure either. Another silence followed. This one felt different. It wasn't awkward. It was filled with things both of us had carried for years. Finally, my father spoke. "I heard your mother came to see you." "She did." "I'm sorry." The words came so unexpectedly that I almost thought I had imagined them. "If you were hurt." Not, "I'm sorry things happened." Simply, "I'm sorry." He continued before I could respond. "Stood up for you." His voice began to crack. "When your mother wrote that letter, I knew it was wrong." I closed my eyes. For years, I had wondered whether my father had secretly agreed with my mother or whether he had simply remained silent. Now, I finally had my answer. I was afraid, he admitted. I kept telling myself things would get better if I stayed out of it. They didn't. No. They only got worse. I leaned against the kitchen counter as tears quietly filled my eyes, not because the pain had disappeared, but because someone had finally acknowledged it. My father didn't make excuses. He didn't blame anyone else. He didn't mention money. He didn't ask for financial help. Instead, he spoke about the birthdays he had missed, the Christmas mornings he should have shared with his grandchildren, and the countless opportunities he had allowed to slip away because remaining silent had felt easier than doing the right thing. "I can't change those years," he said softly. "I know, but I want to spend whatever years I have left trying to be a better father." I took a slow breath. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with a single phone call. 9 years couldn't be erased in one conversation, but genuine accountability had a way of opening doors that money never could. "I can't promise everything will be the way it used to be," I said honestly. "I'm not asking for that. It will take time." "I understand." I looked through the kitchen window at Ethan playing with our children in the backyard. Then I smiled gently. "Maybe we start with a cup of coffee." My father laughed quietly through his tears. "I'd like that." When the call ended, I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't begin when someone needs something from you. It begins when someone is willing to stand before you without excuses, accept responsibility for the pain they caused, and ask for nothing in return except the chance to earn back a place in your life. A week after speaking with my father, I felt a quiet sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Nothing dramatic had changed. My family hadn't suddenly become close again, and the wounds of the past hadn't disappeared overnight. But for the first time in nearly a decade, I no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions. I finally understood the difference between someone who wanted to repair a relationship and someone who simply wanted something from it. A few days later, my phone vibrated with another message. This time, it was from my younger sister. I opened it without rushing. The message was short. "You could have just helped." I read it once. Then I read it again. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years of silence, no mention of the birthday cards that had been returned unopened, no recognition of the children she had never bothered to know, just one sentence suggesting that money should have erased everything that had happened before. I quietly locked my phone and placed it on the kitchen counter. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the need to defend myself. For years, I had believed every accusation deserved an answer. Now I understood that some messages revealed more about the person sending them than the person receiving them. I chose not to reply. The silence wasn't meant to punish my younger sister. It simply reflected a lesson I had learned the hard way. Not every conversation deserves another chance. Over the following months, I met my father several times. We started slowly, just as we had agreed. Our first meeting was at a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. There were moments of awkwardness, moments of sadness, and moments of quiet laughter as we remembered the happier parts of my childhood. My father never pressured me to forgive him quickly, and I never pretended the past had been easy to forget. Trust grew one honest conversation at a time. Meanwhile, my mother never contacted me again. Neither did she send a letter. Neither did she offer the apology I had once waited years to hear. Eventually, I accepted that some people spend so much time protecting their pride that they lose the relationships they claim to value most. One afternoon, while organizing files in my home office, I noticed the familiar navy blue binder resting on the shelf. I picked it up and slowly flipped through its pages one last time. The returned birthday cards, the unopened Christmas envelopes, the ignored voicemails, the family photographs that had never been seen. Every page represented a painful chapter of my life, yet none of them represented who I had become. I gently closed the binder and placed it back on the shelf. This time, not because I might need it someday, but because I finally knew I probably never would. My future no longer depended on proving my past. That evening, Ethan and our children gathered around the dinner table, laughing over stories from their day. Our house was warm, noisy, and filled with the kind of love I had once feared I would never experience again. Looking around the room, I realized something that money could never buy and success could never measure. Family isn't the people who appear after your victories. Family is the people who stand beside you during your struggles, celebrate your smallest achievements, and remain loyal long before the world notices your success. Sometimes the greatest form of justice isn't watching the people who hurt you lose. It's realizing that while they were choosing pride, you were quietly building a life so full of love, purpose, and peace that their absence no longer had the power to define your happiness. If you enjoyed my story, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.